Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? Organizations are harnessing the benefits of using generative and traditional AI technologies to enhance productivity, streamline operations, and foster innovation. However, before employing these tools in the workplace, organizations must minimize potential risks and ensure the ethical and responsive use of AI. On this episode of We Get AI for Work, we discuss the importance of developing comprehensive AI policies, the need for confidentiality, data privacy, and bias monitoring in AI outputs, and the potential pitfalls of not properly managing and vetting the appropriate use of AI technologies in the workplace. Today's co-hosts are Eric Felsberg, principal in Jackson Lewis's Long Island office, and Joe Lazzarotti, principal in the firm's Tampa office, and co-leaders of the firm's AI group. Eric and Joe, given the importance of developing comprehensive AI policies, the question on everyone's mind today is, what factors should organizations consider when developing governance structures for the use of AI in the workplace, and how does that impact my organization?
Thank you so much, Alicia. Welcome, everyone. We're here with another episode of We Get AI. As always, I have the pleasure of being with my good partner, Eric Felsberg. Good morning, Eric. How are you?
Hey, Joe. How are you?
Good. So one of the prior episodes, we talked a little bit about, governance. It's a real hot button issue around AI and implementing AI in organizations. And just kind of to jump right in, I mean, one of the things that we talked about is policies. Like, how do we create policies around this technology? And one of the things we were talking about is, well, maybe there's different types of policies. There's a handbook policy for employees. Maybe there's an IT policy for development. And maybe there's an assessment policy or a privacy policy, right? And what does that really look like? When do we need those? But if we're talking about policies generally, maybe more so a handbook policy for employees. I know there's a lot of interest there in terms of employers thinking about how do we kind of govern employees' use of this technology. Maybe let's dig into some of the what might you expect to see? What are those provisions, and what are some of the issues around those provisions? And one of the things we always think about is, hey, are we using generative AI? Are we using more traditional AI? And does that what is that policy covering? So can you kind of talk a little bit about, when approaching a policy, what exactly is the technology and how might that impact the policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, I think there's one important thing to think about before we get into the specifics of a policy. I mean, it's pretty common that you and I will get a question from, an employer that we're working with who says, hey, do you have an AI policy template you can just kind of send over to me, right? And, and I know our response is, well, broadly speaking, we have certain features we expect to see in there, but the policy really should be specific to your particular organization. And also, and we touched on this on the governance episode about, kind of how AI is going to be used in your particular organization. So is it going to be used, for example, to help select employees, candidates rather for employment, right, as part of your applicant process? Or, maybe it's going to be used as part of your kind of core business model where you're looking to streamline and make more efficient, kind of some of the tasks that you perform on an everyday basis. So yeah, there's not really a template per se, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the features here. And certainly, one of the things that you mentioned is, and this kind of, I think, goes to the use case, right? Are we thinking about using kind of more traditional artificial intelligence platforms where, we're just taking data and we're trying to, make predictions out of these data, identify trends? Or are we using the one that everyone is really interested in, I think, currently is generative AI, meaning, we're using an AI platform that, generally speaking, right, is going to create new content. Once we feed it information, it's going to create new content that didn't previously exist. And to your point, I think, that there's a lot of, the issues differ a little bit, right? Depending on what type of AI is being used and how it is being used. So with generative AI, for example, when you're creating new content and you're going to say rely on that output from the generative AI tool, we're going to talk in a little bit about kind of ensuring accuracy of the output of some of these AI tools. Do you have a method in place for kind of vetting the output that comes out of, some of these AI tools, especially in the generative space? If it's more traditional, I think that still holds true as well, right? How do we know that that particular AI tool or that algorithm is operating in a way that we expect it to, right? That it's performing the calculations correctly, that, we feel comfortable relying on that particular output. And there's a few other kind of nuances that'll apply to each one, but, it certainly is important to identify specifically the nature and type of AI that you're thinking about using. And you really should be kind of thinking about these issues before you actually use it. That may seem obvious, but it's often the case that we get these questions after it's been used for a while and, maybe some harm has resulted, for example.
Well, that's a great point because, early on in the work that we've been doing in this area, I think both of us had this experience where a client will call and say, what is an AI note taker, right? And the reason they ask is because they got on the phone with a colleague and that technology was being employed. And we don't get into that specifically. Maybe we'll talk about that on a later episode in terms of around an example of that technology. But one of the issues I think we expect to see, right, is, and not in all cases, but what uses are approved and how do employees go about suggesting or maybe introducing new technologies that company might benefit from. So what are you seeing there in terms of policies that kind of help, say, hey, to employees, look, these are the things you should use, these you shouldn't, and managing that process so that you don't have that surprise of, hey, wait a second, some employees using this, we didn't even vet it. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and this goes back to the point we made on previous episodes, but as well as earlier on this one is, an AI policy is not something that just kind of drops from the sky, right? We talked about on a previous episode this notion of a governance committee, and you want to think about, the evaluation, right, of these different AI tools, right? So one of the things that we always talk about, and we've spoken about again on a prior episode, is the first thing you want to do is take inventory, right, of all the AI tools that are out there, and also try to figure out, which AI tools that we currently don't have in our possession that we think we might want to use in the future, again, to perform some aspect of our business, whether it's more administrative or more substantive part of our business. And so, as part of that kind of deliberation and evaluation of these different AI tools, you want to think about what should we be using this AI tool for? And is it a tool that should be used kind of more broadly with different tasks, right? But the idea being that each individual tool should be vetted for the specific use, and it should not be used in a way that is inconsistent with the manner by which it's been vetted, right? So if we're using, some sort of generative AI tool to create, let's say, employment policies, and we've kind of vetted that generative AI tool to help us do that, well, that's what the use has been, and what it's been approved for because we vetted it. What should not happen is using that same generative AI platform to create maybe a user manual, for example, right? That really impacts kind of the core aspects of our business because that tool may not have been vetted for that particular use. And when it's used in a manner that's inconsistent with how it's been vetted, that could lead to really disastrous results, right? We don't know if what's coming out of that tool is reliable. Is it accurate? Have we taken steps to try to vet whether that output is accurate? And so, again, we talked about a governance committee, but there needs to be this function where the AI has been vetted. We fully understand what its intended use is, and that the folks different stakeholders that are involved in this have been trained as to kind of how this tool should be used. And any tool outside of that in a policy not only should be prohibited, but we should explain, here are the tools that we vetted, here are the ones that are approved, here are the approved uses, And we're going to talk about it again in a few minutes, but also have a function in your policy so that if somebody does come across a new tool or a new use for an existing tool, that they have an avenue to kind of bring that up and maybe have that tool vetted for that particular use, but certainly wouldn't want to have folks using it in a manner inconsistent with what it's been approved for already.
Yeah, and it sounds like, I mean, there's a lot of flexibility there to structure it in a way that makes sense. Because I think given everything that you're saying, for some organizations that don't have as many departments and employees, some of that might be more streamlined, and maybe in other organizations where you have more defined roles, I imagine that certain employees in certain departments might have the approval to use certain tools where others do not. So it's really thinking about, as you said, what those use cases are and how best to manage it in the organization and set that by policy. And so again, just and we talked a little bit about governance already, but one other thing that also comes to mind from a policy perspective and what we expect to see is how do we manage, confidentiality and data privacy and security. And I know from my perspective, again, we kind of go back to the same issues, right? Driving these concerns, and use cases are critical, and what industry you're in is really important. And so to kind of understand that, I think from a policy perspective, one is also recognizing, I think from what we're seeing, some companies may already have a confidentiality and privacy and security policy. If they don't, they probably should, right? But you don't have to start from scratch in an AI policy all the time to kind of establish basic principles around that. But then the question becomes, what data do we need? What data gets input into the tool? Who has access to that data? And the results from, what you're trying to accomplish with the tool. And so really building on the sensitivity of, you may not be using a tool that is managed and maintained only on the company's information systems. It may be a third party's tool, so that in effect, if you're uploading data for the AI tool and adding to the prompt, depending on what you're trying to do, you may actually be disclosing confidential personal information that to a third party and have not taken all the appropriate steps to do that. So that's certainly an area of expectation in policies, is trying to manage the confidentiality, data privacy issues, and then of course cybersecurity and data security around the processing of data in the course of using the AI. And anything else you're seeing on that, Eric?
Other than, discussions that you and I have had, right? And I think one of the things, for our listeners, when Joe is not in the AI space, he co-leads our data privacy practice group. And so we often have discussions about these issues, even outside the context of AI. But one of the things I know you've said to me in the past, which I think it always kind of has stuck with me, is you're right. Wait, you don't know how these tools are storing data. You don't know who's managing some of these tools. And, if you were to enter in, say, proprietary, company information, or, let's say you're trying to generate a document that is based on client information, for example, right? If you have part of your business, you have clients, this notion of putting into an AI tool, either proprietary information, confidential company information, or client data, it's tantamount to kind of going out on the street potentially and just kind of stapling it to the, telephone poles that are out there for anyone to read, because you just don't know who has access to this thing. And so I always think about that. And, that's something we try to, convey to our clients, which is you want to have very strict parameters on the nature and type of information that may be entered into these tools. But to Joe, to your point, I don't think I've ever seen a situation in a policy where, we feel an employer has felt comfortable, companies felt comfortable to enter into that tool. Again, client information, confidential, proprietary information, whatever else it may be, because of that concern. And, I think it's just absolutely critical that you have this in a policy, because again, to people that are kind of using this casually, that don't spend their time thinking through these issues, they may not think about that. And they may say, how great is this? I put in some client information, I get almost a completed memo back. World is a wonderful place. What you don't know is now who can see that information, right? So, I think about this too, like if you're ever sitting on a plane or a train where people have these kind of, these privacy guards on their phone and laptops, but yet are entering information into like an AI platform. It's kind of funny in some respect, but it's certainly not a funny issue and something that you really should detail in a written policy. And again, we'll keep coming back to this idea of training, but employees and users need to understand the significance and seriousness of this particular issue.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, there's a lot of considerations that go into what type of data are we talking about, right? Obviously we were referring to personal information and others, but there's also like intellectual property and copyright infringement issues that a lot are concerned about. There's been a bunch of case law, and I know we kind of have an upcoming episode that's going to talk about that. So unless you want to delve into anything there, Eric, maybe we can kind of table that one, but it's certainly a significant issue from a policy perspective. Whatever it is, accuracy is critical, right? Of the data going in and the data coming out, trying to ensure that. So talk about that, Eric, a little bit. I know there's a popular case that everybody likes to talk about, especially lawyers, because of course that would never happen to us. But that's that story about the lawyer that wrote a brief, and the AI had what's called a hallucination and made up a couple of cases. I'm paraphrasing, and submitted it to the court, and the court kind of said, "Hey, what's this? We never found these cases," right? But that can happen. I mean, you get an output, but what do you think about in terms of policy there?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and when AI first, especially generative AI, right? To your point, when it first kind of came onto the scene, there were a lot of stories about this idea of hallucination, and it kind of sounds a little funny, but it really is a serious issue. Where, and again, beyond the scope of this particular podcast, but the way that the AI worked is that it produced a result that looked and felt terrific, right? It, in that legal case, it looked like a legal citation, right? It looked reliable, felt reliable, but nobody apparently, kind of vetted that. And, the idea is that that's where some of this generative AI potentially could be a bit nerve wracking, because if you just rely blindly on the output, as has been, kind of been told in some of these stories that we've all heard about, and then that's relied upon, and that particular output that's being relied upon is completely inaccurate, and, with the hallucinations, completely made up, complete fiction, right? And that could be really damaging. And so there needs to be in the policy a very clearly laid out directive that, if the organization decides that you're going to permit AI, that AI really should be a starting place, right? It's meant to come up with the general answer, if you will, right? If you're working on a particular issue, but it's not meant to be the final say, right? So while it may help you set you on the right path to the potential answer, and it may be that the ultimate answer is the same thing the AI initially said, but there needs to be some human interaction there to independently vet that output. So again, Joe and I are attorneys, and, so this is near and dear to our heart. But when you get a citation, go look up that citation to make sure that citation actually exists. And look, the one thing here, and give credit where credit's due, the folks that work on these AI platforms, and Joe, I think you would agree, when these things first came out, this issue of hallucinations was a bit more prevalent. I don't see it as much now, but until this is completely nailed down, airtight, and we feel comfortable this never ever could happen, until that happens, and we may not ever see that in our lifetime, we just don't know, there needs to be a mechanism in place where results are independently validated, separate and apart from the output of an AI tool. So that should be laid out in a policy. And again, just going back to this idea I mentioned earlier, to the uninitiated, they may not even think about this, right? It's all of our jobs to make sure people understand how this stuff works, and how much reliability they can afford to the output of some of these tools.
So reviewing the output of AI is important, right? We're still humans. We still could find some errors in it, even though it sometimes seems perfect. It's important to look at that. But there's a different iteration of that, right? Instead of a case citation or a case name or description being inaccurate, you can have a result that maybe has some bias embedded in it. And I know, Eric, you've been a leader in the firm for a long time around doing analyses for affirmative action and government contract work. And so naturally, I know that you as part of our team, you kind of help clients with, bias audits and examining a lot of the questions around this. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear from a policy perspective, what do you recommend around, policy to kind of monitor for that kind of bias, which I think is a big issue, particularly, in the HR space.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, this is an issue that certainly something everyone should be thinking about. If you're using AI as part of your management, your personnel management process. So again, selecting candidates for employment, who you're going to promote in some instances, who's likely to terminate, and things of this nature. Pay administration, right? You if you're using these tools for anything like that, you have to think about this issue of bias, right? And when we think about bias, there could be situations where, and what I'm about to say is a bit uncommon, where you may have, an AI tool, an algorithm that is affirmatively taking into account a protected characteristic when making, a calculation and producing output. So again, it seems kind of crazy that we have to think about these issues, but what if the algorithm is taking into account somebody's race when determining whether they would be a good candidate for employment? Now, that seems probably obvious to all of us that is not lawful, but what about the situation where the algorithm is taking into account on, facially completely neutral criteria, but for whatever reason, it's having a disproportionate impact on certain demographics, right? No intent, right? It's just having an impact. These tools in the output that you're relying on need to be monitored for impact against certain groups, right? And, for those that kind of practice in this area, that's kind of known as a disparate impact analysis, or even a disparate treatment, where it's affirmatively taking into account. And that may trigger some obligation either on your part, because you are the user, but by extension, the developer, an obligation to have the tools validated, meaning have, kind of an independent study as to how the tool is operating, which criteria, variables it's considering, and kind of how it's assigning value, and how it's producing an output. And, you see this in some of the regulations that are out there for those of you that have employees or jobs in the city of New York. That the city of New York has a law dealing with automatic employment decision tools, AEDTs, that is clearly focused on this particular issue, meaning does it have a bias against certain demographics? And this is a huge concern for the EEO agencies, both on the federal level and emerging on the state and local level across our country. So it's a significant issue. Now, do we want your employees out there all doing their independent bias audits? Absolutely not. But, and for a variety of reasons, which are probably beyond the scope of this particular discussion, but certainly it's advisable, again, subject to your specific situation, to put this in your policy, to say these tools are going to be monitored for bias. We have to make sure that we do this before you embark on, any sort of project using a new tool that hasn't been vetted. Consult with, and again, we talked previously about governance committees, or the Office of General Counsel, or the head of Human Resources, so that we can ensure that whatever platforms that we're using, AI platforms, that they're either free of bias, or, if we do see disparate kind of selection rates or recommendation rates, that the underlying technology has been validated. Really, really important in this area, because again, this is a focus for a lot of regulations that are out there right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just kind of quickly, last couple of points that at least I had, like with any policy, right? There's questions, there's, enforcement of the policy, managing discipline and violations. What are your thoughts there, Eric, on just kind of managing that piece of it? This is going to be new for a lot of employees. And so trying to manage that part of the policy can be maybe a little tricky, given how new it is and how expensive it can be.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of things. One is you want to have an outlet, right, for individuals to ask questions about the existing policy, existing tools. You also want to have an outlet for folks to, propose new tools or new uses for existing tools. And then lastly, an outlet for folks to report violations of the policy. Right now, how do they do that? Well, I think the important thing is you don't want to make it difficult for the user, right? You don't want to have an employee trying to kind of hunt around figuring out who the heck am I supposed to be reporting this to, right? And so this certainly should come out of some sort of governance committee. But again, that should not be left up to the employee to figure out, should I call the general counsel? Should I call HR? So a lot of times what we'll, work with clients to develop is an email hotline, a telephone hotline, or, a dedicated kind of online form that can be submitted. And that kind of goes to this governance committee. And depending on the nature of the concern, the inquiry, then that committee is responsible for getting the particular stakeholders involved. So if it's a inquiry around a potential violation of a policy, and it gets to the committee, maybe that's something that legal and HR need to focus in on. If it's, hey, I heard about this new note-taking technology. I think it'd be really terrific for our engineers in their engineering meetings to do. Well, maybe that needs to go to IT, compliance, and the business leaders, and et cetera, et cetera. But the important thing is you want to make this easy and seamless, because what you don't want to have happen is that if it's too complicated, the employee might just say, yeah, forget it. I'm just going to use it, right? Who cares, right? And they use it. Now suddenly we have a problem later on. So whatever method you use, right? Email, phone, whatever, that should be detailed in the policy. And again, I mentioned training a couple of times. Certainly can be conveyed during a training session with employees so that they know exactly where to go when they have these issues.
Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think we covered a number of things about policies. One thing you mentioned at the outset, Eric, was, and I think it's so right, that this is a pretty rapidly developing area and it's going to have changes. And so I think, like any good policy, you want to have a mechanism to amend it and account for changes and think about how to communicate those changes and to make the new policy effective. So any other thoughts, Eric, on, policies and procedures in the context of specific AI technologies and generally it's a really important topic. So any other thoughts there?
No, like I said, we said at the outset, this area is developing so rapidly, and we're in this kind of interesting time here where, on the one hand, it's exciting, right? We're at the forefront and seeing this, really incredible technology really taking hold. But in terms of developing policies, and this should be in the policy, right? There should be a mention of that this is a policy that is subject to frequent revision and update, because you have to keep up with the developing technology. And, it's probably a good idea to have in there that each time somebody embarks on a project, right, where they're going to leverage AI, that they consult the policy again. And I think that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future until this technology kind of settles up a little bit, or settles down and becomes part of our everyday life. But right now it's developing so rapidly, these policies have to be revisited frequently. So that would be my one last point I would make.
All right. Well, as always, my friend, good presenting with you. Hope this was helpful. If any of the listeners have any questions or recommendations or thoughts, please reach out to us at ai@jacksonlewis.com. And until the next time, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune in to our next program, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.